I have the least pleasant thing to do, and that is, it just seems in this modern age of obliteration of information soon after it's made, that we probably need a little background in the story of the Spanish-American War. So this is relatively short, but it's in some ways it's entertaining, in other ways it's a prophecy. Almost forgotten today, the Spanish-American War survives like so much of the past, encapsulated by an obtuse slogan, "Remember the Maine." Let me build up a little background so we can better understand why Montauk's Camp Wikoff existed at all. I'll start by focusing on the last decade of the 19th century, and much of this story might sound a little too familiar. By late 1800s, we as a nation had expanded our boundaries to the Pacific and settled southern disputes with Mexico. Our pushes for new territories created heavy losses of Native American lives at a time when the military and our national coffers were still shrouded in Civil War debt. We looked beyond the continental United States for developing markets, with plans for a canal through Central America being touted. Our national enthusiasms turned towards the Caribbean. Cuba seemed an excellent investment. Close by, with a cheap and abundant labor force, rich in farmland and natural resources. A little problem, Cuba was ruled by Spain. American citizens soon, though, owned about $50 million of this island's real estate. The profits were worth millions of dollars to those investors who owned mostly sugar and tobacco plantations and also ironworks. The native Cubans suffered under colonial Spanish rule. The island's history was rife with insurrections and small revolutions. The freedom movement of 1895 was serious enough to hinder the success of a number of America's interests. American investors were worried for their profits and property rights. Just getting goods out of Cuba to distributors was being interrupted. President William McKinley was under strong public pressure to defend American interests, and the United States press, under the leadership of William Randolph Hearst and his nemesis, Joseph Pulitzer, needed a cause to their goal of 1 million readers per corporation. Cuba was a crisis in the making. The two competing newspapers created a multi-ring circus of yellow journalism and whipped up John Q. Public's outrage against Spain's mistreatment of their Cuban subjects. There were certainly atrocious activities to report, but the ferocity of the reporting was not balanced. When the Spanish began to move entire Cuban village populations into concentration camps, diplomacy was no longer on the table. We needed an event to justify U.S. intervention, and we were given two, both in 1898. A newspaper got hold of a personal letter written by the Spanish minister to the U.S., sent to a Havana friend calling President McKinley, in quotes, a weakling, bitter for admiration of the crowd, end of quotes, and the sinking of the battleship USS Maine while moored in Havana's harbor certainly was the second. The Maine had been sent to Cuba on a goodwill visit. It had been in harbor in Havana for 3 weeks and was the site of dinners with the new Cuban governor. Optimism seemed to be in the air. The battleship was the largest boat to have entered the harbor up to that time. It was February 15th, 9:10 in the evening. On board, taps had just been heard. The captain was writing a letter home, and then the explosion came. It was a bursting, metallic, screeching and crashing roar of immense volume. There was a tremor, like an earthquake. The ship lurched. The lights blinked and went black. Thick, choking, hazardous smoke blinded the sailors and gagged their throats. The Maine had been blown up and was listing to port. The ship was sinking. 254 seamen were killed, and another 59 were wounded. 8 of those would soon be dead. The Navy conducted an investigation, The Spanish conducted an investigation. The cause of the disaster or who was responsible was really never fully proved. But American newspapers had no doubt about the responsible party. Cowardly Spanish, they said, headlined American newspapers. Hearst New York Journal even published an artist's rendering showing the Spanish saboteurs fastening the underwater explosive while others waited, cheering on, hoping for the explosion to be large as it was detonated nearby. For weeks after the disaster, the New York Journal devoted more than 8 pages a day to the story. Hundreds of editorials demanded that American honor be avenged. The rallying cry was, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." Though apocryphal, Hearst reportedly got a telegram from Frederick Remington, his illustrator in Cuba, in quotes, "There is no war, stop. Request to return, stop." Hearst's reply, in quotes, "Please remain, stop. You furnish the pictures, stop. I'll furnish the war, stop." War was in the air. The Maine was lost on February 15th, and on February 17th, the Naval Board of Inquiry started its investigation. The next morning, the Spanish cruiser Vizcaya arrived in New York on a reciprocal goodwill visit because of the U.S. Maine, but the ship was unaware that the Maine had been lost back in Cuba. It sailed for Havana quickly 8 days later. That same day, Theodore Roosevelt, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, cabled Commodore Dewey, advising him to be ready if war was to be called. On March 8th, Congress authorized $50 million for the war fund. By March 21st, the Board of Inquiry found that the Maine was lost to a mine. 5 days later, McKinley received the report and the next morning demanded that Spain end its war in Cuba. On March 28th, Congress heard the Maine inquiry report. On that very same day, the Spanish inquiry was received. Their finding was that the battleship loss was due to an internal accident. Their finding was that the battleship's loss was no one's fault except the fault of the ship. 2 days later, our U.S. minister to Spain requested that Cuba be given her independence. By the next day, Spain turned down the minister's request. April 1st, the House of Representatives authorized $22.6 million for naval vessels. April 6th, the Pope urged McKinley to not declare war pending his negotiations with Spain. The next day, the ambassadors of England, France, Italy, Germany, Austria, and Russia appealed to the president for peace. April 9th, Spain declared armistice in Cuba, and American citizens began to exit. April 11th, McKinley asked the Congress for war on Spain. Within 6 days, the Army began to mobilize. The Congress declared Cuba independent on May 9th, and 3 days later, the Americans commenced a blockade around Cuba and took prisoner of its first Spanish ship. April 25th, McKinley called for 1,250 volunteers as Spain declared war on the United States of America. That same day brought our declaration of war against Spain, making it retroactive to April 25th, when we had captured our first Spanish ship. We were in war. The official war had started April 22nd, 1898, and it was over when Spain approved peace on September 10th, 1898. On December 12th, the Treaty of Paris ended the conflict. The war had lasted about 4 months. It had cost $250 million. Our treaty established the independence of Cuba, ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States of America, and allowed us to purchase the island of the Philippines for $20 million. We also got our oldest overseas outpost, Guantanamo Bay. Used by our Army since Spanish-American War, we officially leased this 45-square-mile base in 1903. Inspired by our might, on July 7th, we annexed the Hawaiian Islands because our government declared them necessary as a naval base. The Caribbean was secured, owing for the construction of the Panama Canal. We had become an international power. In Asia, shipping routes and military facilities were established. The cost, beyond dollars, 3,000 of our officers and enlisted men died in the war, 90 of them from disease. And now you'll see what happened when the men came to Camp Wikoff. Mr. Heatley?
Well, Richard told you a lot about this, but a point that should be made is that the Spanish Empire ended basically in the Western Hemisphere with their loss of Cuba, and it created a crisis in Spain called, at that time, 1898, called the Generation of 1898. It was a cultural and political crisis because Spain had lost so much of its empire. Okay, on July 25th, the War Department selected Montauk as the site for a quarantine camp. Now, at this point, the war was not over. Santiago de Cuba had been defeated, but there was going to be a campaign against Havana in the fall. So the idea was for the men to come back, spend some time in Montauk, and prepare for the campaign against Havana in the fall. And it was selected for these reasons. Northern latitude, a clear site. There were 4,200 acres that were given at no charge by the Long Island Railroad, or made available by the Long Island Railroad to the War Department. Isolation from populated areas. There were very few people in Montauk at that time. Rail access. There was a rail line to Montauk that had been established in 1895, and there was a deepwater harbor. So these all met necessary requirements for the transports to bring the troops back to the East Coast. This is Chicago Tribune illustration of Montauk at the time. Very few trees. It was grassland, so it was just really rolling hills essentially, and you can see the Montauk Lighthouse looks a little bit different there. The Fifth Army Corps, which was the ground force in Cuba, commanded by General Shafter, had defeated General Tourelle of Spain on July 17th. But what followed, what was happening even at that time, men started to fall victim to the tropical fevers, and it really put the Army in a very precarious position. But they kept getting cables from the War Department down to Cuba saying that they should move the troops or take a train to another location. And there was a meeting that resulted in this letter. It's referred to as the round robin letter. It's fairly famous, actually, because it was a protest against superior officer's order, which is really not something that happens in the military. The War Department wanted them to move. They gave them instructions to do it. So there was a meeting called by General Shafter of the medical people and the officers. And at the meeting, they all decided that they had to send a petition to, they gave it to General Shafter, but it was going to be cabled to Secretary of War Alger to say that the Army had to be moved immediately. Now, Alger had actually made plans to move the Army and had selected Montauk. They didn't know this at the time, on August 3rd, when this meeting was held. They didn't know that Montauk had been selected. They knew that some point on the East Coast would be selected at fairly a northern point. But in any case, they produced this document, and there's some question whether or not Theodore Roosevelt wrote it. He was at the meeting. He offered to write the protest. In any case, he did write one. He wrote one that went with this. And his, of course, was more to the point. Now, this is the headline in the newspapers. Actually, that cable of this letter and the other protest hit the newspapers nationally on August 4th. The problem was that the War Department didn't get the cable until after the newspapers ran it as a headline. And Secretary of War was furious, particularly with Roosevelt, because this was Roosevelt's letter. And he tried to embarrass Roosevelt. And then there was even some talk of court-martial for Roosevelt. And there's some thought that actually, because of Alger's dislike of Roosevelt, he denied him the Medal of Honor. for his actions on July 1st, the charge up San Juan Hill. That was corrected, by the way, by President Clinton. He was awarded the Medal of Honor. Roosevelt was awarded the Medal of Honor in 2000, I believe. But in any case, Alger, the Secretary of War and Alger didn't really get along well. This is the order from the War Department after they had seen the cables from the men from Shafter. And this was the order to send the men to north, and these were the transports that were there and the number of men that they could take. And that was ordered on the 4th, shortly after the round-robin letter had been published nationally. Now you can imagine, well, first of all, there were 25,000 soldiers, essentially, 22,500 in Cuba that had to be moved up to Montauk. And there were 7,000 in southern camps that were also brought up to Montauk. So there was really a combined population coming into Montauk of about 29,000. And they were on their way. They got on transports in Cuba. It was about a 5 to 7 day trip. And Montauk was selected and had to prepare itself for the arrival of thousands of men within a week, essentially. And it was an incredible task. And here you see, these are local carpenters probably, building the village around the Montauk station. There must have been about at least a dozen buildings that were constructed. They also had to put in piping for water. They also built some wells. Now, the Long Island Railroad paid for all of that. They said in the arrangement with the War Department, they would provide all of these things at no charge. But of course, they were going to be transporting all of the soldiers, so they would make it up in the ticket sales, I suppose. But and they did transport a lot. All of the men, virtually all of the men who came by ship to Montauk, left Montauk by train. So, and then there were thousands of visitors, and there were thousands of others who were involved in the camp. So they were transporting easily 50,000 during the 10-week period. And the Red Cross, the American Red Cross, was formed in 1881, and this is the first war that they actually had an opportunity to perform their mission, which was to help soldiers, in warfare. Now, as it turned out, the government couldn't provide enough nurses, and all the nurses in Army hospitals at that time were male, but they did contract with the Red Cross to provide nurses. Just because they couldn't meet the demand. You'll see as we go along here. The first soldiers to arrived from a southern camp, and that was on August 9th. So actually the order to establish was only made a week before, and the soldiers started coming in. Now why, I'm not sure why, and I don't know whether it was ever explained, why those soldiers from the southern camp were brought up to Montauk. But they were also suffering from disease. They were suffering from malaria, yellow fever, typhoid, and so forth. So it was probably just to move them to a northern location. Here's the hospital design for the general hospital. There was a general hospital which was located pretty much where Montauk Downs is. And then there was a detention hospital or camp of 4 acres located where Montauk Manor is. And when the men debarked from the transports at Fort Bond Bay, they would go up to the detention camp for 4 days. And then if they were well, they would leave that. If they were still ill but not dangerously ill, they would go to the general hospital. And the ones that were severely ill would remain in the detention hospital. This illustration I just put in there because I thought it was odd. If you can imagine an editor saying, illustrate men sleeping in the rain at night. But he did it. He did a good job. I don't know who the illustrator was. By the way, they didn't have bylines at that time, so none of the articles have bylines. Oh, a few of them do, but mainly the articles didn't have bylines. And the illustrations weren't really clearly indicated. On the 12th, McKinley named the camp at Montauk after Charles Wikoff, who was the first officer killed in the Siege of Santiago. Young calls halt. Now, General Young was the one put in charge of getting the camp in order. And he realized that they just didn't have enough time, didn't have enough people, and he wanted the transports to slow down. Well, of course, down in Cuba, they wanted the men to get out of Cuba. So, and Alger was concerned about getting them up there too. Alger originally, as I mentioned, just wanted to wait until all the men were healthy to transport them north. But of course, with the round-robin letter, the demand was to move them even if they were ill. So they were coming up, and of course that meant more hospital space. Ellen Hardin Walworth, the director and founder of the Women's National War Relief Association, became really known as the Camp Mother. She did extraordinary service helping the soldiers. Now these soldiers here are actually the ones from the southern camps because the others haven't arrived yet. Her daughter, a Vassar student, volunteered to also serve in the hospitals, and she eventually initially worked in the general hospital, but then also volunteered to work in the detention hospital. Oops, sorry about that. This is the ambulance at that time, carries 4 with other improved facilities. So 4 at a time, and there were thousands coming up who were ill. So on the 12th, the war was over, essentially. There was a protocol assigned, at least in Cuba, and Spain quits the New World. So it was basically a 10-week war, I believe. Secretary of War John Hay referred to it as a splendid little war because it was so quick and decisive. And it did raise the United States to world power. These were the first soldiers from coming up on a transport, the Gate City. And Home Sweet Home was a very important song for the soldiers at that time. They sang it down in Cuba, and they sang it here in Montauk, and they sang it on the transports coming up, or played the music. So it meant a lot, and it's curious that the relationship with East Hampton. This is probably the most important point about Camp Wikoff. America's first veterans of a war fought overseas on foreign soil, the 5th Army Corps, returned home to Montauk Point in August and September 1898. Before that, there was the Mexican War, but that was not overseas. So these were the first veterans of a foreign war fought overseas, and of course all the wars since that time have been fought overseas. The Veterans of Foreign Wars traces its roots to Camp Wikoff. If you check Wikipedia, it won't tell you that, however, but it is the case because 13 soldiers of the 17th Infantry, which camped at Shadmore, because of what was happening at Camp Wikoff, formed the American Veterans of Foreign Service in 1899, which went on to become the Veterans of Foreign Wars. But the VFW celebrated its 100th anniversary in 1898, and it does trace its roots to Camp Wikoff. And of course, everybody was totally jubilant about the victory and peace and coming home again and so forth. And the whole theme of home is very interesting in Camp Wikoff because it meant so many different things during the 10 weeks. But this is the Brooklyn Daily Eagle expressing pretty much how most people felt at that time about the victory in Cuba. Now this was August 15th, and actually there had only been one transport that had arrived at this point. So those ships that you see there were probably hospital ships. One might have been the Red Cross yacht, the Red Cross, and I think there was one, the steamship, the Shinnecock, I think, was one, and so forth. But that pier you see there was built by the railroad, and it must have been built within a week or so, and it actually has a rail spur, as you can see. And that was to help move supplies on and off, off the ships as they came in. It's hard to make out, but this was actually a double-page spread in the World publication, which was Joseph Pulitzer's publication, by the way. And it's a bird's eye view, it's pretty much of a drone view of Fort Bombay at that point. Anyway, they would come in, you could see the Montauk station a little bit, and then there were some formaldehyde sheds and so forth. The clothes that the men wore were put in, sanitized one way or another, and then they moved on to the detention hospital and then over to their camp or to the general hospital. These are some of the statistics. It's not a full list of them, but now this is based on a 6-month occupancy of Camp Wikoff. At that point, on the 15th of August. I guess there was some thought that the camp might last longer than it did. But you can see the number of men who would be stationed, 24,000. The 4,200 acres was a campsite, and 1,300 represented the lakes. Anyway, the list was very long. You can see 30,000 pounds of fresh beef and so forth. This is what they estimated they need. Getting it there in time for the men became another problem. Throughout the camp, you would see the Army wagons going from one campsite to another. Of course, Montauk's huge, actually, if you're on foot, and it's pretty big if you're in a wagon as well. So they had to, these were coming and going all throughout the entire existence of Camp Wikoff. Roosevelt and Wheeler arrived on the 14th, I guess, the 15th, the 15th of August. And, Roosevelt, of course, was very positive about the whole experience. And a tremendous reception to the Rough Riders. Roosevelt was the national hero in the war, and very charismatic, of course, and the Rough Riders were all totally devoted to him. He and Leonard Wood developed or launched, actually, the Rough Rider organization, or regiment. And they did it in such a short order, too, because the war was declared on the 21st. They were all volunteers. They had to get the volunteers together. They all had to be either they had to be both expert marksmen and expert horsemen to be a Rough Rider. And they had 20,000 applications. They selected 1,000. So of the 29,000 soldiers in Montauk, only 1,000 at most were Rough Riders. There's some misconception that they were all Rough Riders. Not true. And this is General Wheeler and Roosevelt leaving the, probably on their way to the detention hospital. Wheeler was also on that ship. And this is the detention campground that they had to stay in for 3 or 4 days until they were released from that. And the brave 71st, that was the New York Volunteer Regiment. They came back, and it was a shock to see them, as you can see in this photo. This is before and after, but it's a question of like 2 months. But these are based on photos. By the way, I should say this, that there were no halftones reproduced on a daily basis in 1898. They were done on Sunday editions, but not daily. And that's why I relied on the illustrations. Some of the illustrations, however, were based on photos. They just couldn't reproduce them on a daily basis in the papers. Now, this question has come up many times, and this is the answer to it. A long time ago, my father asked me to find out if Theodore Roosevelt ever stayed at Third House. That's the answer. And it was in the New York Times, and you can check it. He stayed there one night, and he may have stayed there 2 nights. But on the 18th of August, he was at Third House. General Wheeler, really an extraordinary man. He was a general in the Confederate Army and a general in the U.S. Army. He's one of 4 men who were generals in both. He's the only one who saw action in both wars, one on the Confederate side and then with the U.S. Army. His daughter was a Red Cross nurse, and she was tremendously important in the General Hospital. But he was an excellent man. He served 16 years in Congress. His estate down in Alabama is a historic site. This was the beginning of the arrival of a lot of the sick men. As you can see, the ships, the Transport Mobile, the Transport Seneca, the Transport Comanche, and 306, 73 sick, 114 sick. And on the way up, some of the men died and they were buried at sea. And that was really a tragic, absolutely tragic occurrence for the relatives of those who were buried. This was listed in one of the papers, I'm not sure which, but you can see most of them are from Massachusetts. They all are from Massachusetts. This is just a hospital scene at the time. Men being... A young lieutenant said this, and it was true of Camp Wikoff: we have life and we have death, because even though there were nearly 29,000 soldiers who went through Camp Wikoff, not all of them were ill. A lot of them were in very good health. and they hiked all over the point. They went to the lighthouse. They all sorts of things. So on the other hand, however, there were thousands who were ill. So they had both extremes here. And then, of course, they had to deal with the weather. There was a storm that came through on the 24th. One of the reasons I decided for the book to use newspaper accounts is because the accounts were so vivid to my mind. It would have been kind of pointless to rewrite it or try to rewrite it. So I edited from 25 newspapers the various accounts. And of course, at that time, a lot of the journalists were really aspiring writers. And so they started out as journalists. And so you can see that in some of these accounts. Certainly the last paragraph there, then began a most superb spectacle of lightning, a duel between two cloud monsters, the one approaching from the west and another which had swiftly risen from the southern horizon. Broad sheets of levin flooded the air with tingling brilliance, and between the floods the storm giants flung blazing spears at each other across the expanse of corrugated sky.
That's levin.
Of flood, yeah. I mean, it's, no, lightning. I'm sorry, it's lightning. Now, there's some question of whether anyone died of starvation. It did happen. Lieutenant William Tiffany was a Rough Rider. He did die of starvation, partly. He was also ill at the time. But he died in Boston. And the reason I include it here is that he was actually on the Transport Allegheny, which was a hospital ship from Cuba. It moored for a short time in Fort Pond Bay because they needed some more provisions. They were told they would have the provisions within an hour. It took 6 hours to get the provisions from the dock to the ship in Fort Pond Bay. I believe that delay cost William Tiffany his life. They said that the number of sick suffered as a consequence for that delay. As you can see, he was a member of the Knickerbocker Club, grandnephew of Commodore Perry, and nephew of August Belmont. I don't know whether he was related to Comfort Tiffany. And this is one of the incredible illustrations that you'd see across the country. He fought for his country only to die of starvation at home. And this was Roosevelt saying about Tiffany, his tribute to Tiffany. And the point he makes here is there a peculiar element of sadness in the fate of these young fellows who have reached the shore for which they longed only to die. And that became increasingly the case. And this illustration by Homer Davenport, a very famous illustrator, killed by Spaniards 200, killed by official negligence and incompetence 2,000. So there was a wrath building nationally, directed mainly at the Secretary of War. So because of what was happening, there was an effort to look into the management of the war by the War Department. Here, Secretary Alger visited the camp for 2 days, and here he's shown one of the unfortunate soldiers in the General Hospital by General Wheeler. And this is what he said about it. Now, he said that, it was far better than I had been led to believe from the newspaper accounts. So the issue was yellow journalism at its peak, basically, in 1898. And the question is, how truthful were the articles? Were they embellished? Well, I think to some extent all you have to do is look at the body count at the end of the war. Those weren't made up, and you'll see at the end what happened. But you also have to keep in mind, and this was the case, that most of the soldiers were volunteers, and volunteers weren't used to what the regulars were used to in terms of camping and roughing it, basically. And so there were a lot more complaints from the volunteers than from the regulars. The standing army, when this war started, was 25,000 men, and they actually called for volunteers, and I think there were like 200,000 that volunteered nationally. So the bulk of the army was really a volunteer army. And Susan B. Anthony and her opinion of what was going on. It's probably the case. This happened off Napeg Beach. The auxiliary cruiser Prairie ran aground, mistaking the Ponquag light for the Montauk Point Lighthouse. And it started to make the turn, and it was ran into the beach, basically, offshore. Now, what happened here is really extraordinary to the credit of the people locally at the time. They actually came out and helped rescue the men from the ship. They were brought by surf boats to the shore, but the local residents, mostly the men, went out and helped carry the sick soldiers to shore. On shore, the local citizens provided a lunch, breakfast, and other comforts to the sick soldiers. So it was really an amazing effort by the local citizens at that time. Ambrose Higgins, of course, all this time, we had to build the infrastructure for the camp. And Ambrose Higgins was the one in charge of it. He was 25 years old, a University of Pennsylvania graduate. He was a surveyor, a civil engineer, an electrician, a photographer, and a draftsman, and a lawyer, too. It was all of those things, and he did a superb job getting lights throughout the camp. It took a while. It took like 12 days or something from the time he got there to get the lighting throughout the camp, actually, and power as well. Again, a somewhat typical scene, unfortunately. The men came back really incredible. A lot of the men came back so weak they couldn't even walk. And this is a scene. This one is really kind of a famous one. Certainly it should be famous here, by J. Campbell Corey. And it does refer to the reconcentrados, the peasants that were moved to concentration camps in Cuba. What happened there is they moved them from the farms into concentration camps, and the peasants died of starvation. The report was that 400,000 peasants died in Cuba. That actually angered a lot of Americans, and it's another reason why we wanted to drive Spain out of Cuba. So the soldier asked how much better off he is than a reconcentrated in Cuba. It was difficult getting supplies just to the men there, even though the supplies might have been available. At one point, one soldier said, well, how can this be when New York's only 115 miles away? The city's only 115 miles away. Why is it that we don't have provisions? Now, again, it's a healthy camp as well, and every afternoon Roosevelt with some of his men would ride down to the ditch plains and go for a swim. And he was in... When McKinley came to camp, Roosevelt said that he was the healthiest man in camp. So, Colonel John Jacob Astor was also at Montauk, and he was also in Cuba. But he did bring provisions on his yacht, Normahal. And a number of ships did arrive from various points, from the North Fork, from New York City. They also came by train from various points from Long Island, from Hempstead, Bayshore, and certainly the East End contributed a tremendous amount in providing delicacies, because the problem is that the food that was provided by the Army wasn't really digestible for the men in the condition they were in. Okay, by the 28th of August, there were 2,100 sick in the hospitals. Now, the hospital was originally designed for 500. So first they had to build a hospital for 500, and then they had to expand it to accommodate 2,100. They just were coming in so quickly that it was always catch-up, essentially. And Montauk became known as a pest hole, basically, nationally, because of the lack of provisions. And here, again, is a good example, victor and victim of the soldiers from the 5th Army Corps. Now, here you have the other side of it. A great deal of rot has been written about the condition of the hospitals. And so, on the one hand, Alger says that the newspapers weren't really telling the truth, and here Surgeon Major Brown says that, a lot of it's rot. So, however, again, you can do the body count at the end. Women nurses at Blessing, and here's a good example, again, of Annie Wheeler and what she devoted. She said, Thank heaven there are many intelligent, refined, highly educated women thoroughly versed in all the medical and surgical, etc., necessary to the profession of nursing. In short, trained nurses who are able and willing to attend to the sick and wounded. And they deserve tremendous credit, the nurses who came as volunteers. This is another Homer Davenport illustration. This was a New York, again, volunteer, the New York 71st. Again, they were basically emaciated in many cases by the diseases. Now, the primary disease was malaria, but there have been accounts that a lot of the malaria cases were actually yellow fever, misdiagnosed. But in any case, the men suffered severely from malaria, and also, if in some cases, yellow fever. And here the New York Times reported that there was yellow fever at Montauk. They tried to keep it down because one of the worries was that yellow fever would spread more quickly than malaria. At that time, they didn't know that yellow fever or malaria was transmitted by mosquito. They actually didn't know, and not knowing that, they thought they were contagious diseases, and they're not. But in any case, there was that fear, and there had been a number of yellow fever epidemics and also typhoid epidemics and malaria epidemics within the United States in the 19th century. So it was a concern. No one wanted to say yellow fever was at Montauk. Now, the spoil system was also a major issue, and Alger was criticized. The appointment of Alger was criticized as just being made on a political basis, not because of competence. Roosevelt said of Alger in a private letter, he said, Alger was incapable of learning from experience. So he kept making the same mistakes. Samuel Parrish wrote a letter to the New York Times, again critical of Secretary Alger and of the War Department, and demanding that more action be taken. And for campaign purposes at the next election, remember Camp Wikoff may be as effective as it in its way as Remember the Maine. Now, this is the Transport Allegheny. Now, the Transport Allegheny was really a cattle ship, and that arrived on the 1st of September. You can see the headline, Floating Hell, and this is from the Boston Globe. It was mainly Massachusetts men on board. Again, a question of severe disease, buried at sea. It was a tragic occurrence whenever they did bury because they would stop the ship. And when the men on board, when they realized the ship was being stopped, they knew someone was going to be buried at sea. Now, this is what it meant, actually. At last came the dispatch telling of the regiments embarking on a transport. He was coming home, and no one will ever know how he wanted to get home to father, to mother, and to brother. Died at sea, the paper said this morning, just as shore was almost in sight. And now the brother asked with voice dangerously near breaking, "Can you tell me, sir, whether he was buried at sea?" The sympathetic manner of the official and his evident respect for those who grieve wins your admiration. But there is a troubled, respectful look in his eyes that tells you he's trying to frame his answer so as to hurt the least. And that happened. There were at least 60 men buried at sea en route to Montauk from Santiago de Cuba. General Shafter and General Wheeler, they both were in command of the camp. Wheeler from the August 19th to September 5th, and Shafter from September 5th to at least mid-October. And another example of a woman from Connecticut, I believe. Anyway, exhausted from the demands required. Again, nation shame. Now, this is just week after week of these reports of men dying and debilitated at the camp. On September 3rd, President McKinley tours the camp. The night before, by the way, he stayed overnight in the Pullman cars at the Amagansett station, and arriving the next morning at Montauk for a five-hour tour. And it was Montauk's great day at that time, 1898. All the healthy soldiers were there. The Greek president, he went to each of the two hospitals, and he visited with each of the men, even though he was warned not to go into the detention hospital, at least into the certain area of the detention hospital because of the contagion. But he gained the admiration of the soldiers with his visit. This, by the way, this map is actually at Montauk Lighthouse. It was an original map of the camp done in September 1898. Now, the thing to keep in mind is what happened with these troops. They would come up, and then they would camp, and then they would be assigned to other posts, and they would leave. So there was always a transition of campsites going on. But note that the pier up on the left there, and of course the Montauk station would be there. And there's the detention hospital, the general hospital. The Great Plain where Roosevelt speaks, of course, is down where the infantry located there. And Third House is way off to the right. But the camp was really pretty much immense. And with thousands of people in addition to the soldiers visiting. There was no restrictions for visitors. They could visit the camp. They couldn't go to the detention hospital, however. That was barred, but they could visit the general hospital and visit the campsites. And these are some of the cartoons that appeared, not cartoons, but illustrations that appeared at that time. And here he is speaking with one of the ill soldiers. And then he spoke to the men. He said, "I'm glad to meet you. I'm honored to meet the brave men who stand before me today. I bring you the gratitude of the nation to whose history you have added by your valor a new and glorious page. You have come home after 2 months of severe campaigning, which has embraced assault, siege, and battle, so brilliant in achievement, so far-reaching in results as to earn the unstinted praise of all your countrymen. To the Army and Navy, to the Marines, to the regulars, to the volunteers, and to that Providence which has watched over them all, the nation today is full of thanksgiving and praise. The brave officers and men who fell in battle and those who have died from exposure and sickness will live an immortal story, and their memories will be perpetuated in the hearts and the history of a generous people. And those who were dependent upon them will not be neglected by the government for which they so freely sacrificed their lives." And then he was given a 3 cheers for the president by the 5,000 soldiers that were there. And they, of course, want to go home. This editorial in the Boston Globe, of course, the whole effort was to free Cuba. Actually, there was a Teller Amendment to the Declaration of War passed by Congress that the United States would not occupy Cuba. We never had any intent to occupy Cuba. We wanted to liberate the population, stabilize the country, and then leave. So it was never a question of conquest. So we wanted, obviously, Cuba to survive as an independent nation. This is just a typical camp scene. You can see the tents and the the barren hillsides and so forth in the distance. This, I think, is the Rough Riders in the foreground. A nurse's opinion. It has been said that newspapers have been sensational in their statements regarding the camp, but my judgment is that the attack should be continued. This is, again, a refrain that's repeated again in other editorials. And here's John L. Sullivan's opinion. And he thinks the country should go broke on the heroes. It ought to send home every man who returned from the war as fit as when he enlisted and with money in his pocket. And that's from the great fist fighter. Fever wrecks huddle like sheep in a pen. Again, the suffering continues. Overcrowded hospitals and so forth. Helen Gould actually donated tens of thousands of dollars to help the soldiers. And she came to the camp several times. She was also a founder of the Women's National War Relief effort and a friend of Ellen Walworth. But she did an extraordinary job in support of the soldiers. It was, again, also a place for healthy men to enjoy themselves. So here you have, it was a park for a lot of the men, and they made the best of it. Here they call it, in this piece, they call it Uncle Sam's Seaside Park. Is a promised land for every man who is strong enough to get out into the air and stretch himself out on the soft turf. So you have the life and you have death theme going throughout the camp. And here you see some Chicago residents greeting the 1st Illinois. And keep in mind that soldiers from all over the country came to Montauk. And Camp Wikoff was the focal point nationally for at least 10 weeks, as people were concerned about the soldiers and concerned about relatives and so forth, or men who might have fought in the war. Leaving Montauk was also difficult because the men, even though they might have survived in the hospitals, they were weakened by the diseases. So they had a difficult time. And as it says here, they often had to wait 4 to 6 hours at the train station to get a train out of the camp. Unfortunately, General Wheeler's son, Thomas, drowned trying to save the life of a friend who had just recently recovered from a debilitating fever. This was devastating to General Joseph Wheeler, as you can imagine. He even said at the time that he wished they had both been killed in Cuba. He would have preferred that than to lose his son in Montauk and to survive his son. So the whole camp was basically devastated by the loss because General Wheeler was extraordinarily popular. And here's the proof of some of the sensationalism, the value in sensationalism, where they lie buried at Camp Wikoff. I have a count from the death register in East Hampton of over 300 men who died in Montauk. And there's a paper with the list over in the display there, and what they died of and their age and the regiments they were with. So you can imagine how depressing this must have been in the camp. Again, Alger was blamed for incompetence. Now, you have in Alger's defense, however, that I think a lot of his decisions were based on the Surgeon General's opinion. And the Surgeon General originally, when he looked at Montauk and was asked about yellow fever, he said, no, there's no reason to worry about yellow fever in Montauk. It's too isolated. But he thought also that soldiers should recover in Cuba before they came up to Montauk. And of course, the round-robin letter urged that they be transported immediately. And President McKinley finally did ask for a probe of the War Department. And of course, here you see Secretary of War Alger investigating the Secretary of War Alger, which is really a great cartoon or illustration. East Hampton Star, remember Camp Wikoff. Again, saying that there were just not enough newspapers, not enough press to report all the tragedies in Montauk and let people know what was going on. And the real fault of the press is Joseph Pulitzer's The World. Says, no, the truth is that the fault of the press has not been sensationalism, but too long silence. Suppression of criticism, ignoring of mistakes, and of the manifest mismanagement of the Army, instead of telling the public and Mr. McKinley the plain, honest truth. That has been, as is now seen, the real, serious, lamentable fault of the press. You should keep in mind, however, that the U.S. Army in 1898 was not really in very good shape to begin with. The Navy was a little bit better off, but the Army obviously improved dramatically after this. But Spain really had a better army, but we had a greater will. So we were able to defeat them. On September 10th, now, Roosevelt, there was a question of whether Roosevelt would run for election in November. However, the incumbent Republican governor was seeking re-election, and when word started to circulate that Roosevelt should be governor, it was pointed out that the delegates to the Saratoga Convention were already selected, and there was no chance that Roosevelt could be selected. Now, Senator Thomas C. Platt was a political boss at the time called the Easy Boss, and he was opposed to Roosevelt because he thought Roosevelt was too independent. But because there was such a groundswell of support for Roosevelt, Platt changed his mind. He didn't want to be on the losing side. So, but Roosevelt said that he would not talk politics until he was mustered out of service. Now, the mustering out took a little longer than he anticipated, so he just made the statement through Colonel Lovell Jerome that he would accept it if it was offered to him, but he wasn't going to say anything about it. The hospital ship Missouri was the next to last ship to come in. It had 262 men on board. It was a hospital ship. 135 of them had to be carried on stretchers. But when they arrived, 62 were able to walk on their own. So actually the hospital ship was beneficial. When Roosevelt mustered out, he was given by his men the Frederick Remington Bronze Bronco Buster. And he says this: we parted with many in the fight who could ill be spared, and think that the most vivid memories that we will take away with us will be of those whom we left under Cuban sod, and those who died in the hospitals in the United States, the men who died from wounds, and the men who, with the same devotion to country, died of disease. And then he left camp, I think, on the 14th. Again, September is a great month in Montauk, as you know, so they were enjoying it, the good weather. And then the breaking up of Camp Wikoff started around the 17th. It didn't really end until October 9th, when the last regiment was ordered out. This is a very important point, I think. The corrector, Sag Harbor corrector, ran this. When the final chapter of Camp Wikoff comes to be written, the ministering angels from Long Island Hamptons of both sexes should have their names well blazoned. The devoted men and women from these Long Island villages who have given their time, their means, and their best efforts to alleviate the sufferings of the soldiers at Montauk Point deserve and should receive not only the thanks of the War Department, but the gratitude of the people of the United States. From the first, they provided substantial and sensible assistance, and although hampered in every way by red tape and absurd regulations, they persisted in their errand of mercy. You can't say enough about the people who helped at Camp Wikoff. And they were volunteers. They risked their lives going there. And there were some tragic consequences. Here's Secretary of War Algier as portrayed by George Lukes. Not a flattering portrait, as you can see. And this is William Randolph Hearst, who published the New York Journal. Personal friendship, political obligation, whatever the motive may be, has proven stronger with the President than the sufferings and the deaths of the Republic's soldiers under circumstances that have amazed and shocked the world. This was a shocking event. The stories coming out of Camp Wikoff were just unbelievable across the country, and they were certainly unbelievable as well in Europe. Talk of starvation, insufficient supplies, men suffering needlessly. This is the cover of Collier's Weekly. Now, I didn't, for my book, I only used this particular magazine cover. But again, the story of home, the theme of home. Here he is home, but a lot of his fellow soldiers, wouldn't be leaving the camp. Very dramatic cover, and really tells the story of Camp Wikoff. On the other hand, General Joseph Wheeler, who was a long-time soldier, who fought in the Civil War and, of course, in the Spanish-American War, he was a true soldier. The camp was well laid out. The chief defect was a lack of nurses. I telegraphed left and right for these, however, and they were soon supplied by the Red Cross and kindred organizations. When Camp Wikoff was most populous, there were 28 square miles of tents, and the scene presented was most beautiful. That's a positive outlook. At the Saratoga Convention, famed orator Chauncey M. Depew said this in nominating Roosevelt for the Republican gubernatorial position. For this year, for this crisis, for the voters of the Empire State, for the young men of the country, and the upward, onward, and outward trend of the United States, the candidate of candidates is the hero of Santiago, the idol of the Rough Riders, Colonel Theodore Roosevelt. So he was nominated. As it turned out, the incumbent governor, Governor Black, ended up backing Roosevelt, which was a good gesture on his part. Roosevelt made his first campaign speech at Carnegie Hall to an absolutely packed standing room only crowd. And he said this, and this is a great statement, I believe. This was a concluding statement of his speech. They were American soldiers, no more and no less. Living, each one strove incessantly to do even more than his duty, scorning to do less and ashamed to falter or ask for aid. Yet always glad to help a brother who, however willing, was weaker. Dying, each faced with equal courage the fate which, in an instant of time, blots out all the differences that we rear with such infinite labor on this earth. Living and dying, they gave us a lesson in American citizenship, and this lesson which they taught in the world, let us profit by as we live in peace. On the 6th, the next day in Montauk, there was a service for the men who died. What happened was they stopped doing service taps whenever a man died during the encampment because it was considered depressing, of course, to the soldiers that were still in the hospital. So all the burials were silent. In this particular case, this was a service for all the men who died during the camp. On October 9th, an order came down from the Secretary of War to send the 7th U.S. Infantry to Michigan, and that brought Camp Wikoff to an end. It lasted from the first troops arriving by train from the southern post on August 8th to October 9th. Now this is the Vassar, this is the student, this is the daughter of Ellen Walworth. She did volunteer to work in the detention hospital, and she refused to leave her post until the last patient had gone his way. Then she told her mother that she too was ill. Miss Walworth's illness developed into typhoid fever in its malignant form. She died at the Presbyterian Hospital in New York City on October 18th, 1898, and she was probably 22. but she gave her life helping the soldiers at Camp Wikoff. Very tragic, of course. And then, of course, when most of the soldiers had gone, you had the gloom of Montauk, as described by the East Hampton Star. Montauk is not what it once was, said an old fisherman. There's a weird gloominess about the place from which one cannot escape it as he walks around and sees the buildings, which a month since have been fairly alive with human beings, now boarded up and left as sad reminders of the scenes of pleasure, joy, delight, sadness, sorrow, and misery, which were alternately presented during the existence of Camp Wikoff. Roosevelt won on November 9th. As you can see here. And this is the report of the War Commission. This is a great sentence, by the way. It's one sentence, and it concludes the report. In concluding its labor, it is with much pleasure that the Commission reports that notwithstanding the haste with which the nation entered upon the war with Spain, the resulting in almost inevitable confusion in bureau and camp, the many difficulties of arming, assembling, and transporting large bodies of hitherto untrained men, the carrying on of active operations in two hemispheres, the people of the United States should ever be proud of its soldiers who, cooperating with its sailors in less than 3 months, put an end to Spanish colonial power, enfranchised oppressed people, and taught the world at large the strength and ability of a great republic. And that's how they felt at that time. And what? I'm sorry. And you have to understand, too, one of the things that happened in the Spanish-American War, even though it's relatively neglected as wars go, it was really a seminal event in military history. The United States, of course, Civil War preceded it. The First World War followed it. The United States rose to global military power with its victory over Spain and it started its liberating populations, which it's done since with the Cuban peasants. The Treaty of Paris, this is back at the beginning. So that concludes it. Happy to answer questions if you have questions. Yes, sorry. Oh, sorry. The what? Oh, that's when your friends get jobs. Yeah.
Before the civil service in this country, when the one party or the other got in, they brought all their friends in and put them in place.
Yeah, but you still see that happening now.
Was there local illness and death?
Yes, yeah, there were people. Yeah, as a matter of fact, Mary Nemo Moran died of typhoid fever in the spring of 1899. Now, her daughter worked out at the camp in Montauk and did get typhoid in the fall, and it is thought that she actually died from the typhoid that her daughter brought to the house. She was a nurse, yeah. I'm sorry.
I was going to say there was something called the East Hampton Relief Corps.
Yes, there was East Hampton
And the
Relief
two
Corps.
heads of it were Mrs. Manson, who lived right on Main Street
Okay.
here, who was later the suffrage leader here, and then Mrs. Woodhouse, who endowed
Right, okay,
the library
right,
in Guildhall.
right.
They were the heads of it, and they're reported in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, and they were said to be indefatigable in their work, working night and day
Yeah.
to take care of the troops, and they set up a diet kitchen for special foods, like for the men who had dysentery and things like that.
Well, there were also auxiliary hospitals established in Sag Harbor and East Hampton in homes, and when the men were a little better, they would come out and they would stay at these homes until they were healthier. But there were a number of them accommodating, a few up to as many as 20, I believe.
And
Yeah.
they raised all these funds to buy cups.
Right, they did raise a lot of funds.
And food and clothing, and they listed all the people who had donated. It's all in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle.
Yeah. Oh, no, it's a tremendous effort on the part of the East End, not only in East Hampton, on the North Fork as well. They sent supplies. Any other questions? I have some images up here if you want to look in the display case.
What are you at work on next?
I'm still working on Camp Wikoff. I'm still working on it. I have put forth a proposal for a national military park. And there are 9 national military parks in the United States now. Camp Wikoff should be the 10th, and that would end the National Military Park as originally conceived in 1880. Because it was, these were wars fought on in the United States, not overseas. So the National Military Park represents, I think there's 6 Civil War ones, there's, and so forth. The reason this one should be included is that the men, to my mind, it could be argued that what happened in Montauk was really the last battle of the Spanish-American War, the men fighting disease. It was actually, for a few days, it was actually active in the war, an active camp in the military effort. When it was established, a few days later, of course, a peace protocol was signed. But I have a proposal on my website for that, if anyone's interested in seeing it. It basically uses the existing parkland and also creates a memorial walk at Montauk Station down to Fort Pond Bay, and basically some plaques and memorials and statues for the troops at various points, from Shadmore to Third House to Montauk Downs and so forth, other sites. But
what's the status of it?
well, what happens with this? This is what happens with it. And I did make an effort about 5 or 10 years ago, and I made a mistake of making the wrong proposal, and that was turned down by the town. This proposal is a revision of that, and it's the procedure is this, and I've talked to the VFW about it. You have to, it has to be approved by Congress, for one, and the National Park Service has to be approached first, and to do that you need an organization. You make your case, you have an organization, a group of people from the area who would present the proposal. The National Park Service would never impose anything on a community that it doesn't want. So that's the protection. I mean, it can go ahead with this, and then if the community decides it doesn't want it. But if the National Park Service thought the idea was viable, it would go to Congress, and then Congress would have to approve it. And then at that point it would become, it would.
Do you have an organization?
Well, I have, the proposal I've made has is supported by West Point. It's supported by West Point. It will be supported by the VFW. The VFW can't support it at this point because they only do that in August and only when something's been proposed. And so they can't do it beforehand, but I've been told by the someone in the organization that it would support, it should support it because it's where the VFW started. The first veterans of a foreign war returned to Montauk, so it makes perfect sense. As I said, the proposal I've come up with is is non-invasive. It just uses existing parkland, but it also creates a conference every spring on the Spanish-American War in April, and with 5 topics from the war itself to the Rough Riders to Roosevelt to the camp. Yeah. So anyway.
What is your website address?
It's aaqeastend.com. It's art and architect. East End. I have cards here, but it's Art and Architecture Quarterly. If you just do that, you find it. Yeah, if you want to look at it, it's listed. I have 2, also, by the way, I have 2 other portfolios on the camp that are different from this one. I mean, some of the images are the same, but they're different. One's August and the other's September and October. And I will probably revise this in some way and also put it as a portfolio on the site. So if you go through the index, the contents, you'll see the 2 Camp Wikoff portfolios and the proposal portfolio. And I will add this one as a portfolio in the coming months.
Where are the veterans buried?
They were moved, the ones that, a lot of them were sent home. But the ones that were in Montauk were sent to Cypress Hills. Yeah, they were buried there. And I don't know exactly the number. It's hard to get exact numbers on the number who died and so forth. It varies. And,
Some were unidentified.
yeah, there were some unknown. There were at least 5 unknown.
Is there a cemetery at Montauk for these men?
No. They were all moved. They were all moved, yeah. Actually, as a matter of fact, there's very little in Montauk that references Camp Wikoff, which is shocking to me. The county had, by the way, and I don't know whether any of you attended the 1998 centennial that the county sponsored. That was terrific. They did a lot of events and so forth, and it was just the wrong weekend. That was the problem. But they dedicated a boulder out there with the names of all the regiments that were at Montauk. The county did. And of course, they changed the name of Montauk Park to Theodore Roosevelt County Park. I understand it's been changed back to Montauk Park. But Roosevelt did stay there. His wife stayed there. His daughter stayed there. And 2 visits to the camp while he was in Montauk. So.
There is a rumor going around, you hear people say, oh, Theodore Roosevelt never stayed there.
Well,
But you're saying, for sure, yes.
New York
it says-
Times.
They
Don't
say
believe
it,
me.
I know.
Check the Times.
I know, but why are they circulating?
I don't know why.
that?
It's absolute nonsense because he said he slept in a civilized bed. Yeah. So, and I think he might have stayed 2 nights. I know he left. Thank you.